Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Yep, we're running it back because you guys asked for it. A little bit ago now, I made a video going over every original killer in the game, including Ghostface because he's an original character with a licensed mask, and recommended to the people who like these characters some horror movies to enjoy that remind me of those killers. These picks were based on tone, or character designs, or themes, or just vibes, and a lot of people really liked that video. Notably though, I did leave licensed characters off the list because the way I saw it, you could just go watch or play the source material they come from to get the experience. You shouldn't need a YouTube video to tell you that if you like the Xenomorph from the hit game Dead by Daylight, then you might enjoy Alien. I thought the demand for me to talk about the licensed characters was going to be low, but the responses I've received from this video seem to suggest otherwise. So that's what this video is going to be. We're going through every licensed killer in Dead by Daylight and recommending to fans of those characters some horror movies to watch if you want some further viewing this spooky season. Of course, this comes with a couple of additional rules compared to the last video. I can't recommend a chapter's own source material, obviously, but I'm also not going to double up and put any movies on the list I recommended in my originals video for another killer. For example, I would recommend Army of Darkness for Vecna, but I'm not going to cover it in this video because I already recommended it as viewing for the night. So, let's get going, shall we? If you like Michael Myers, you should watch Black Christmas, High Tension, and Trick or Treat. Michael Myers was the first licensed killer ever added to Dead by Daylight way back in Halloween 2016, and his arrival in many ways laid the groundwork for what DBD is today. Similarly, Halloween was the codifier for the slasher horror subgenre that films for decades would go on to imitate, even though it wasn't strictly the first slasher film ever. 1974's Black Christmas is a great example of a pre-Halloween slasher. It never had quite the long-term prestige of the Halloween series, but it's a truly exceptional piece of cinema that many consider superior to Halloween, and that I can thoroughly recommend. If you're a fan of an enigmatic and overbearing slasher, obsessed with their chosen prey, try out the 2003 French film High Tension. The film is definitely controversial, some who watch it love it, others can't stand it. I think I sit somewhere in the middle. But if you want a fantastically violent modern slasher full of, high tension, try out High Tension. And while Halloween as a series has expanded beyond a grisly tale of a Halloween boogeyman story, if you like that element of the first film and how it used Halloween as a setting, I can advise taking a look at Trick or Treat. It's probably the classic Halloween party flick. It's a fun anthology that truly feels like the kind of spooky ghost stories you might tell around a campfire, or whispered by torchlight at a midnight sleepover. At least as far as I can guess. I didn't really do that as a kid. I spent my time looking up saw traps on Wikipedia because Wikia and the Saw Wiki didn't exist yet. So yeah, watch Trick or Treat. It's an ideal movie to get into the Halloween spirit. If you like Leatherface, you should watch X, Raw, and Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. Similar to his licensed predecessor Michael Myers and his immediate follow-up Freddy, Leatherface is a proper OG of horror, and as such, went on to inspire a whole subgenre by himself. The rural, visceral grindhouse horror that consistently churns out some amazing horror movies. Ty West's X is a great modern reimagining of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre's ideas and setting. It's an exceptional piece of grindhouse horror that uses the overlap between steamy sex, bloody violence, and surprisingly complex character work to tell a genuinely engaging and provocative story that owed a lot to Texas Chainsaw and the conventions it established. Alternatively, if you like the cannibal angle of Texas Chainsaw a lot and appreciate how heavy-handed Tobe Hooper was with the relationship between meat eating and cannibalism, I really like Raw, another grotesque and gritty French film similar to High Tension. It follows a young woman who's been a vegetarian for her entire life, but is introduced unwillingly to meat for the first time and rapidly finds herself lost in a newfound addiction. Raw is a deeply discomforting experience that is really not for everyone, but it's a staple of cannibal horror that needs to be seen to be believed. Tucker and Dale is completely at the other end of the spectrum though. It's a brilliantly self-aware horror comedy picking apart at the tropes and images that were established by Texas Chainsaw and the many films it inspired. It follows a pair of hapless hillbillies trying to fix up their vacation home, a dusty cabin in the middle of the woods, but is set upon by a group of terrified college kids and wind up in a fight for their lives. And if that premise doesn't sell you on how much of a blast this film is, I don't know what will. If you like Freddy Krueger, you should watch The Invisible Man, It, and Summer Party Massacre 2. It's no secret that Dead by Daylight's version of Freddy Krueger is not the one many players originally wanted. We didn't get the classic Robert Englund version of Freddy, but instead the remake version starring Jackie Earle Haley, which went down about as well as mustard gas at a children's birthday party. Nevertheless, both versions of Freddy play on the same kind of horror, even if they go about it in very different ways with vastly different tones. Freddy Krueger has always been a symbol of repressed memories and trauma, and the Dream Demon is as much a manifestation of the kid's trauma that they experienced at his hands as he is a malevolent being in his own right. In that vein, I can recommend both adaptations of Stephen King's It, as well as Lee Winnell's reboot of The Invisible Man. It is pretty much the definitive horror movie if you're looking for childhood trauma manifested as a supernatural threat that plays on your fears. Freddy and Pennywise are very much cut from the same cloth, and the 80s setting, the original movie series, drags the two even closer together. The Invisible Man, on the other hand, touches on a lot of the things that the remake of Nightmare tried to do, except I'd argue it did it much better. Freddy's at his scariest when you're trying to explain to someone that he exists, that he's threatening you, he's going to kill you, and you need their help. Because not only will they not believe you, they're more likely to push you even further into his grasp than they ever are to help you. The Invisible Man perfectly captures that paranoia. Cecilia spends the entire movie with what's almost the ghost of her abusive ex stalking her, and no matter what she says or does, nobody will ever take her seriously. The exhaustion of restlessly knowing you're never alone, the violation of being haunted by something that you can't get rid of, and the stress of being totally helpless to prove you're not going mad. Yeah, these films have a lot in common. If you prefer the goofy 80s campiness of the original version, then I have a different recommendation. Slumber Party Massacre 2. The Slumber Party Massacre series is kind of a cult classic. I like all of them apart from the third one, but 2 is by far the most fun and you don't need to watch the first one to enjoy it. It's a wacky horror comedy with heavy musical elements themed around this guy, the supernatural slasher, the Driller Killer. The actor who played him, Atanas Illich, is incredibly charismatic on screen and never really appeared in anything else again. His dad was the guy who found Little Caesar's Pizza, and he just sort of cropped up for this movie before disappearing again. Illich just steals the show as the Driller Killer and gives some great early Freddy Krueger vibes that I can't recommend enough. If you like Amanda Young, you should watch Seven, Escape Room, and Cube. Saw defined much of the landscape of horror for the 2000s, but it didn't do so out of nowhere. The original Saw owes a lot to David Fincher's extraordinary crime thriller Seven, where 2 embittered detectives follow the clues of a deranged and methodical serial killer conducting brutal murders by his own bizarre set of rules. It's a puzzle we can watch unfold as the film plays out, and if you watch Seven immediately before or after Saw, you will definitely see the inspirations. Escape Room and Cube bear more similarities to the later installments of the series that revolve more around the idea of a deadly game or puzzle that sets the series apart from a standard crime story. Alongside Seven, Cube was a huge inspiration behind the original movie and incorporated sci-fi elements that showed off the fun ensemble cast and allowed their characters to take on more depth and moral ambiguity as the story continued. But while Cube is a small movie that predated Saw, Escape Room is in many ways a modern high-budget take on what Saw often does. The games are theatrical and cruel, and the subjects are mostly relatively innocent victims, but much like the original Saw, the focus remains on the victims, unlike modern Saw movies which often focus more on Jigsaw and his ideology. Escape Room, Seven, and Cube are all great movies I'd recommend for anyone who likes Saw as much as I do. If you like the Demogorgon, you should watch Fear Street, The Colour Out of Space, and both versions of The Blob. Cosmic horror. One of the most beloved horror subgenres out there, while also being one of the hardest to commit to film without completely butchering the concept behind it. Stranger Things managed to bring cosmic horror stories into the mainstream by mixing it together with charming 80s nostalgia-bait aesthetics, and if you want a horror series that manages to balance heavy nostalgia with legitimately effective horror atmosphere, then Netflix's Fear Street is a great choice. The time period jumps around between installments, but regardless of when the stories are told, it all just comes together with a fun cast of young talent and some surprisingly effective tension when the time comes. Plus it has a ton of Stranger Things alumni, so what's not to love? If you like the idea of an unknowably strange outer space monster terrorising a small American town and a plucky gang of teens trying to survive it, who would I be if I didn't talk about The Blob? It tells the story of an alien monster landing and devouring much of a town. It's a simple and campy B-movie that still managed to set the bar for decades of horror movies to come, and kickstarted the career of one Steve McQueen. Oh, and the remake has a 19-year-old Shawnee Smith in a leading role, which is a hell of a blast from the past. But if you want a more serious take on cosmic horror than the sheer campiness of The Blob, The Colour Out of Space has pretty much everything you could want. In this modern retelling of the H.P. Lovecraft story, the sheer reality-melting terror of the colour warps the family mentally and physically to tell an engrossing and compelling tale, with great performances from everybody, especially Nicolas Cage. Wait, hang on, isn't he that guy from DBD? If you like Pyramid Head, you should watch The Machinist, Shutter Island, and Possessor. Silent Hill is one of the most influential horror series of all time, and Silent Hill 2 is widely considered to be one of the best psychological horror stories ever told. Pyramid Head is a reflection of James's guilt, and while I have touched on plenty of guilt and trauma related psychological horror in my first video, there's some more I think we could add to the list when the specific angle of James's guilt and subconscious desire for punishment get brought along. The Machinist is a perfect example. Christian Bale transforms his body into the haggard Trevor Resnick who lives his life as, well, a machinist, but is somehow kept awake by an endlessly haunting image. As to what it is, I guess I'll just have to watch it and see. For a similar reason, I suggest Shutter Island. I can't properly talk about why, but trust me, if you've seen Shutter Island, you'll know why. But there's one film I don't think many people will expect me to talk about here, and that's Brandon Cronenberg's 2020 sci-fi horror masterpiece, Possessor. The story follows the assassin Tessa Voss, who uses advanced technology to control people's bodies remotely and possess them into killing her targets without raising suspicion. And you might think this is an odd choice for a Silent Hill recommendation, but I see Tessa as more or less the opposite of James Sunderland, so consuming the two pieces of media back to back makes for a super interesting experience. In Killing Mary, James more or less experiences a failure of empathy. Difficult circumstances and a whirlpool of murky emotions result in him killing his wife, and the entire events of Silent Hill 2 revolve around how his love for her and guilt over what he's done coalesce. It's his empathy calling him out for what he did and demanding he lives with the consequences. Tessa undergoes the exact opposite growth. Her empathy gnaws at her like a disease, and while James's journey in Silent Hill 2 demands he hold himself accountable for what he did, Possessor's journey is one of self-effacement, of Tessa learning to remove herself from the actions she commits and the love she feels for her own family so she can be better at what she does, erasing her empathy and her identity to become the ultimate killer. It's a truly harrowing film that lingers with you long after the credits roll, and I cannot recommend it enough. If you like Nemesis, you should watch Cloverfield, A Quiet Place Day 1, Evil Dead Rise, and Wreck. The original version, not the remake. Finding films for Nemesis is on the surface fairly easy. He has zombies, let's go for a zombie movie, right? But Nemesis himself isn't exactly a zombie, and Resident Evil 3 isn't just any old zombie game. If I could express what makes Resident Evil 3 and Nemesis scary, it's these two words: urban apocalypse. It's not enough to simply have a bunch of scary beasties. The cramped urban atmosphere of Raccoon City becomes oppressive and claustrophobic when zombies can be around every corner, or a gigantic bioweapon can shatter the walls and chase you through its streets. To me, Cloverfield and Wreck are the two definitive urban apocalypse movies that use the found footage shooting style in two completely different ways. Wreck is gritty and painful, as it drags a news reporter and cameraman, people who should be spectators, into the nightmare of the outbreak firsthand, while Cloverfield goes for a spectacle that uses the perspective of an ordinary citizen to highlight the chaotic helplessness of a citywide threat. Quiet Place Day 1 is a newer film that recaptures the overwhelming alien presence of Cloverfield excellently, and while the city is depopulated and, well, quiet for most of the runtime, there are tons of moments that truly make the most of the setting to make our protagonists feel small and helpless. Plus the characters and story work are just sublime. Definitely my favourite of the three Quiet Place movies. Evil Dead Rise definitely has less to do with Nemesis directly than these other films do, but if we're talking about an oppressive urban atmosphere, it would just feel wrong not to include it. The cramped and somewhat impoverished urban environment makes the intrusion of the Necronomicon into the home environment feel oppressively huge and impossible to overcome or escape, something you'll really notice if you watch it after the other Evil Dead movies with their rural abandoned cabin. Evil Dead Rise is the third Evil Dead movie I've recommended in these videos, and I stand by it for Nemesis, so go and take a look. If you like Pinhead, you should watch Candyman, Necromentia, and Prince of Darkness. If Stephen King is the father of horror literature, then Clive Barker is its gay uncle. And while Hellraiser is probably his most famous offering to the horror world, it's far from the only one. Candyman is the other big name associated with Barker, and I can thoroughly recommend watching either the original movie from 1992 or the legacy sequel by Nia DaCosta that came out in 2021. Both movies are absolutely excellent. They take heavy creative liberties with Barker's work, just like the Hellraiser film did, but they're definitely still worth taking a look into. If you want something closer to Hellraiser in terms of content, I can advise Necromentia and Prince of Darkness. Similar to Hellraiser, framing the promises of the lament configuration as some kind of forbidden fruit, both these movies deal with the temptation of hell in different ways. Necromentia follows an addict who falls into the service of the demon Morbius, and its mythos of hell and its denizens reminds me a lot of Leviathan and its bonds of service and supplication. Meanwhile, Prince of Darkness, one of John Carpenter's more underrated movies, takes the more sci-fi approach that Clive Barker's original book version of the Cenobites had and has some fun with it. The Cenobites are effectively aliens from another dimension that take on the affect of religious devotion. So a horror movie that stars a priest and a quantum physicist working together to form a more complete understanding of the denizens of hell as beings of antimatter, it's really quite inspired. Definitely worth your time, I think. If you like Sadako Yamamura, you should watch Skinamarink, Talk to Me, and It Follows. Back when Ringu released in 1998, many called it the scariest film that they had ever seen. And whether or not you think Ringu deserves a title today, if it ever did, it's impossible to deny the impact Ringu had on stories of curses and hauntings in the 21st century. No more spooky ghosts in haunted houses, or finding the spirit's unfinished business so it can finally pass on. Ringu and the stories that followed it used modern technology and an unremittingly bleak tone to strangle helpless characters under the sheer terror of a power that they couldn't possibly understand. Talk to Me is my favourite movie of 2023 for this exact reason. The horrifying power of the hand is used in a genuinely unique way at first, going from a party trick for bored teenagers to a curse that grotesquely mutilates its victims and puts the pressure on our cast to solve the puzzle before it's too late. Talk to Me is charming and brutal and deeply, deeply miserable, and I just love it. Skinamarink is another case of a similarly overbearing supernatural threat, this time in an enclosed modern setting. Skinamarink is not a film for everyone, but the emotions it evokes, the sheer helplessness of those subjected to the living nightmare, are palpable, and reminded me a lot of Sadako's Curse, especially with how it's mercilessly inflicted on children who don't really understand what's going on. Finally, It Follows is a movie that I have a less than stellar relationship with. It's about as subtle as a ton of bricks dropped from a crane onto your head, but it similarly captures the draining, emotionally fraught paranoia of Sadako's Curse, and the idea of the thoughtless actions of others leading to your inevitable, inescapable demise. The Ring is a wonderful exercise in making you feel doomed on the character's behalf, and representing that as a physical, shambling force does a lot of work to power the atmosphere that It Follows carefully cultivates. If you like Albert Wesker, you should watch The Belko Experiment, District 9, and Overlord. If Nemesis is the embodiment of RE3's urban apocalypse, then Wesker is the embodiment and ultimate product of the Umbrella Corporation's history of eugenics and profiteering at the cost of whoever and whatever is in their way. It's hard to say that Resident Evil 5 is really about anything, because that implies that RE5's writers were paying attention while they were writing it. But if it is about anything, it's about expansion by experimentation. Massive corporations using their wealth to subject native populations to unethical experimentation in the interest of maximising profit and corporate power. And Wesker's involvement in the story shows how an ideologue can use that corporate power to further their own cruel goals. In terms of films I've found that manage to accommodate this, my pet picks are District 9 and Overlord. District 9 is a classic of modern science fiction as it tells the story of a society divided by a system of oppression and cruelty that's held up by a mixture of corporate interest and a willfully blind ideological hatred. Overlord, on the other hand, is possibly just the best war horror movie of all time. It follows the story of a bunch of American soldiers stuck behind enemy lines the day before D-Day, who find an off-the-books Nazi facility. The facility contains labs and testing chambers to mutate subjects into monsters to be sent to the front lines, and it's treated with all the gravity that, in my opinion, RE5 should have had. Pilu Asbek's Vafna fills that Wesker role too. He leverages the power and strength of his position and the experiments that he's working on to cause a ton of damage in pursuit of his own selfish motivations, under an institution willing to look the other way. Go take a look. The film as a whole reminds me a lot of Wolfenstein, so if you like that sort of thing, then it's perfect for you. The other film here, The Belko Experiment, is a little bit different. Even though it has the word experiment in the title, it really doesn't have anything in common with the bizarre bioweapons you'd expect from Resident Evil. Instead, the experiment is much simpler. An office block of people have to fight each other to the death until only one is left. It's brutal, it's cruel, it's darkly comic. It's tonally questionable, and it's a really unique experience that I think you could have a lot of fun with. If you like the Xenomorph, you should watch Slither, Sting, and Event Horizon. Alien is one of the most influential films of all time, so naturally if you're an Alien fan looking for similar viewing, there's going to be plenty of films for you to choose from. If you want a new movie that you might not have seen, then Sting might be a good call. Sting's an old school creature feature about a mutated alien spider that's adopted by a little girl before terrorising her family's home in a New York apartment complex. Sting is probably not going to be a massively award-winning movie, but it's a really fun film that's very unashamed about its horror inspirations and has some fantastic practical effects that just nail the modern B-movie vibes. When I watched the film in cinemas, I was the only person in my screening, so I'm going to guess that you haven't seen this either. Maybe this Halloween would be a good time to change that. Event Horizon is a great pick for a sci-fi horror movie that captures the vision that Ridley Scott had for Alien and the Alien prequels that he made. It isn't just about a creature that lives in the vents and gives you a danger pregnancy, it's about the mythology where the line between aliens and gods starts to get blurry, and humanity's place in the universe starts to feel oh so very small. Seriously, Event Horizon is a banger, and it's also the closest we're ever going to really get to a Warhammer 40k movie, so yeah, it's got a lot to love. If you prefer extraterrestrial horror flicks with a dash of comedy, however, then James Gunn's directorial debut Slither might be right up your alley. It's an eclectic body horror spectacle with delightfully gruesome B-movie energy and some strong performances from great actors like Nathan Fillion, Elizabeth Banks and Michael Rooker. It's a very James Gunn movie. If you're familiar with his later works like The Belko Experiment and Peacemaker, you'll really start to see his hallmarks. Slither's bizarre, eclectic body horror perfectly nails the balance between giving you the ick and making you laugh. So yeah, I think it's worth a go. If you like Chucky, you should watch Gremlins, Puppet Master, and Orphan. Yeah, Chucky is one of the best known horror characters in Hollywood on the back of his comic stylings. Chucky is, at his core, a silly little guy who leans on conventional horror tropes and the fourth wall a little bit to leave a unique mark on the horror landscape, and the closest I can think to a similarly subversive and fun horror comedy that's full of silly little guys is Gremlins. Especially the second one. You don't need me to talk about Gremlins. You know it, you love it, just watch Gremlins. But if you're looking for something with a similar off-the-wall vibe to Chucky and Gremlins is a bit more of a B-movie, the kind of thing you'd find at the back of a video store in the mid-90s, Puppet Master is ideal. The original movie features the puppets who became the iconic characters of the 15-film series as the underlings of a schemer brought to life by an Egyptian curse, but they rapidly outshine the human characters and make a series of incredibly campy horror movies that I kinda love. Well, some of them anyway. If you're a fan of installments in the Child's Play series like the original or Curse of Chucky, however, take things a little bit more seriously and play off the earnest fear of a threat present in your home that only a kid can see but can never be believed, Orphan is a surprisingly apt choice here, I think. Even from the get-go, Esther's behaviour is very obviously wrong. You don't know quite what's wrong with her, but you know something is. And while the kids quickly catch on, well, they're just kids. Who's going to believe them? It's the exact same fear that Child's Play successfully evoked all those years ago, but presented in a more serious modern context. If you've not watched Orphan or the prequel First Kill that in my opinion surpasses the original, I think you could do a lot worse than taking a look. If nothing else, Isabel Fuhrman is an icon. Like, you've got to see her as Esther, she's so good. If you like Vecna, you should watch Phantasm, The House of the Devil, and, hear me out on this one, Ghostbusters. Vecna is a strange killer to bring up in this list because high fantasy and horror movies tend not to mix. Just like Vecna feels a little bit out of place sometimes among DBD's killers, it's hard to find films that evoke Vecna's imagery and ideas while staying true to what DBD does. The science fantasy horror movie Phantasm is the first thing that jumps to mind for me. The otherworldly presence of the tall man and the ruthlessness with which he pursues power really reminds me of skinny Thanos over here. And Phantasm in general manages to strike the rare balance of strange fantastical concepts alongside a genuinely unnerving horror atmosphere. The House of the Devil is the second Ty West film on this list, and it is grisly to a fault. I don't want to talk too much about what goes on in this movie, I think you just got to see it, but the whole film is one giant play on the Satanic Panic scare of the 1980s. The setting and subject matter were very deliberately chosen to evoke the Satanic Panic, and the images and ideas that moral guardians like Mary Whitehouse told stories about. The same stories they told about Dungeons and Dragons. If you wanted to scare a concerned suburban parent from the 1980s, so they could stop their young Timmy from playing the devil's game, this is the kind of film you would show them, and supernatural elements really fit with Vecna's blend of dark magic and arcane science. Speaking of supernatural elements, yeah, I'm gonna say it. Ghostbusters is probably my most out-of-field recommendation for one of these videos, because Ghostbusters always gave me the vibes of a D&D adventure. A party of eclectic misfits who spend half the time at each other's throats, getting into misadventures and dealing with threats that, at least in theory, are far more serious than the tone of the movie they're in. Much like Vecna, Gozer is on paper a legitimately terrifying villain, whose appearance should make you shit yourself. But just like Vecna has had his ass stomped hundreds of times over the years by legions of dysfunctional murder hobos, Gozer is in every way turned into a joke by being squeezed into the bizarre and glorious action comedy that's painted in the colours of a horror B-movie. It sounds odd, Ghostbusters as a Vecna movie just sort of works for me. Maybe it does for you too. If you like Dracula, you should watch Abigail, The Last Voyage of the Demeter, and Nosferatu. Now Dracula, on the other hand, that's a killer with a hell of a cinematic pedigree. Count Dracula is one of the most well-known public domain characters in the world, and there's been so many adaptations of the character as a result, of which Castlevania is just one. This makes it perhaps ironic then that my first recommendation is a film that the filmmakers insisted in a court of law was not based on Dracula, 1922's Nosferatu. Nosferatu is an unauthorized adaptation, or as the kids say, a rip-off of Dracula, with the serial numbers effectively filed off. But this movie is so old that when it was made, Dracula was still in copyright and Bram Stoker's heirs tried to have the movie destroyed. But it's for the good of horror cinema forever that a few copies managed to survive the court's order. I'd go so far as to say that every horror movie ever made since the birth of the Technicolor film, or even before, I'd go so far as to say that every horror movie made since the birth of Technicolor film, or even before, has owed something to Nosferatu. It is the definition of a classic, and I think everyone should watch it. Oh, and a remake is coming at the end of the year, so think of it as a preliminary research project for when that hits on Christmas Day. There's been a long history of Dracula adaptations and reimagining since Nosferatu though. I'd love to show you a couple of my favourites that came out in the last couple of years. The Last Voyage of the Demeter and Abigail. Demeter puts a nice spin on the classical Victorian Dracula tale. It uses the enclosed environment of a Victorian cargo ship as a way to entrap our victims with the vicious count, treating him more like an apex predator playing with his food than any sort of nobleman. Demeter's release was pretty limited, especially overseas, so there's a good chance you missed it, but it's on streaming, so go watch it. On the flip side, Abigail sits at completely the other end of the horror spectrum to Demeter. Abigail is a fun modern horror comedy starring some of the best acting talent currently making horror pictures. Melissa Barrera, Catherine Newton, Dan Stevens, frickin' Giancarlo, man! And they're brought together by the guys at Radio Silence who wrote Scream 5 and 6. It's got everything. Great soundtrack and production design, a compelling story, awesome practical effects, the best child acting I have seen since Megan, and lots of fun banter and dialogue that includes, in my opinion, the best line delivery of 2024.
I got him! Sammy, those are fucking onions.
I'll be doing a video at the end of the year where I go through and talk about my favourite horror film 2024, and Abigail will be appearing on the list. It's not the #1 spot, but it's pretty high. I cannot praise this film enough, just go watch Abigail for your own sakes. And last but not least, if you like Springtrap, you should watch Willy's Wonderland, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and The Black Phone. Yeah, I know he's not in the game yet, but Behaviour have announced the FNAF DLC really early, like they announced it 21 Concords before it actually comes out. And since we know he's coming, it would feel kind of churlish to leave Springtrap off the list here. He might not be in the game proper yet, but the chair has already got his name on it, and if nothing else, this video will age better for it. Willy's Wonderland is the obvious cinematic parallel to Five Nights at Freddy's, a cheesy family restaurant filled with murderous animatronics, dodgy management, and a silent protagonist who's exceedingly done with their shit. Nick Cage, oh hang on, that's the guy from DBD again, puts on a really fun and action-packed performance leading Willy's Wonderland, and while it's not the greatest film on earth, I think it's worth a go if you're a fan of the FNAF style and want to see it on the big screen in a way that feels very different from the actual FNAF movie. Similar to how I pushed Saw as recommended viewing for The Skull Merchant, I think it's fair to recommend Nightmare on Elm Street for Springtrap fans, even though Freddy is allegedly in Dead by Daylight already. Freddy and Springtrap are surprisingly similar villains, being child murderers who are brought back from the dead through dubious means to continue tormenting the world. It only stands to reason that they'll get reunited in the fog next year. And last but not least, Scott Derrickson's amazing picture The Black Phone is, in my opinion, the best expression of a character like William Afton I've ever seen. A cruel bastard unlike any other, who preys on kids for seemingly no good reason, and hides behind masks and characters to efface themselves and cover up the monster within. The ghosts of the children he killed might still aid you or seek you out, but that won't bring them back. All that might do is buy you a little peace and maybe, if you're lucky, stop you being his next victim. So with that, we've gone through every killer, both licensed and original. I just hope this video has been of some help to you. Halloween's right around the corner, just that time of year for you to settle in with a scary movie, and who knows, Maybe somewhere in this video your new favourite horror film is just waiting for you to discover it. Let me know in the comments if something in particular I've talked about in this list has caught your eye, or if you watched anything that I recommended in the last video since you watched it, and what you thought of it. I'd be really interested to hear what you guys have to say.